Second part. Though the alien's aim had been true, one membrane that escaped its blast skimmed the creature's left arm. What had been like a strip of cloth suddenly became a blade. It tore through the alien's armor, and fresh blood gushed out. Green, in this case. The alien backed away. It had realized what the exquisite flying things really were. As the fear swelled inside it, the alien turned itself around and dashed off in the opposite direction. Lurie ran over to Gray, then looked down to the far end of the corridor. The flames were still burning. Reflecting that firelight, the new membranes that appeared had a reddish glow. "What are these things?" Lurie murmured. "A kind of monster Gilzen made, modeled on alien DNA mixing technology," Cray said, his voice painfully hoarse. "The DNA I got from him tells me that." These things were offshoots produced while Gilzen was trying to accomplish his aims. He intended to use them as guards or something, but they were too vicious to serve any purpose. So they all got locked up in a room underground for 10,000 years. No, not even a year's passed since the first one was put in there. These things are mortal freaking monsters. Who's to say how many of them died, and how many survived? How many were there? A lot? 5,000? Probably all that survived were the ones that could get by without drawing energy from outside. Maybe 10. Give or take a couple. 10 of those flap of skin thingies? Yep. Run for it. How did they get out? How should I know? Get a move on. Can you stand, mister? You needn't worry about me. About little old me.
Is Adrian still here?
What's more important? Those placards I gave you? They're grave markers. I'm counting on you with those. Lurie gazed at the outlaw's face. It was an earnest look. Cray had probably loved those two women as well as someone like him could. Getting up, Lurie grabbed one of Cray's arms and pulled on it. "Don't. I can't move. So make a break for it." A thin membrane was drawing nearer to Cray's feet. "Go." Giving a violent swing of the arm the boy was holding, Cray sent Lurie reeling backward. Somehow the boy managed to keep from falling over. Straightening himself up and looking over at Cray, the membrane that had drifted over had grown rigid without warning, and it was just flowing past Cray's chest. Cray's head dropped back behind his torso. Speechless, Lurie was rooted to the spot. Down by his feet, a white cloth-like strip drifted along. Up it floated, its edge aiming straight for the boy's neck. What? A stark flash of light joined the boy's backward reeling body and the deadly membrane. Nailed to the floor by a rough wooden needle, the membrane twitched as only a living creature could. But it quickly grew still. D. From the far end of the hall, a figure in black raced closer with a sword in his right hand, and the warrior woman following him also carried glittering steel. Hacking off the flapping membranes near Lurie in no time, D scooped up the boy without saying a word. "Wait," the boy said. looking down at Cray's remains. Normally, that was the sort of sight people shut their eyes to. But out on the frontier, you got used to seeing things like that while still in your infancy. Looking at Cray's head, Lurie thought, he's smiling. His fallen torso had its right arm extended in the boy's direction. Lurie's tears overflowed. A split second before Dee's needle had pierced the membrane, that arm had knocked Lurie out of the way. We're definitely going to plant these up top for you, the boy thought, his grip tightening on the little placards in his pocket. There's just no end to this, Lilia cried out. At her feet was a pile of membrane she'd sliced. Now it looked like 10 times as many were flying down the corridor. What are these things? The boy replied to Lilia's question. They're monsters Gilson had locked up. I see. I'll get the story from you later. Dee? Retreat. By the time she called it to the young man in black, he'd already advanced about 15 feet. What an ego. She was about to go after Dee, and then he halted. Up ahead, a black form flecked with shades that were difficult to describe had appeared. Without a single corner to it, it called to mind a beetle. But since it lacked limbs, it apparently relied on the tank treads on its bottom half to move. Surprisingly enough, those treads weren't mechanical. They were clearly organic in nature. Perhaps it was equipped with some sort of sensory apparatus, because although no eyes were visible on it, it slowly moved what appeared to be its head from side to side, and then turned toward Dee. Lilia turned around and said, It's no good. There's a ton of them coming. The other end of the corridor was choked with the membrane creatures. Death was closing on them from both sides. Fear tightened its grip on Lurie's heart. He clung to Dee's shoulder for all he was worth. Beneath his fingers, the hunter felt like iron. Relief and trust warmed the boy's heart. Here was a man who'd fought the nobility and always triumphed. Dee stepped forward. A sword in his right hand. That had been enough for him to carve his way through any danger. Lurie was no longer afraid. At that moment, there was a sound of scraping stone to their left. From the depths of the stone doorway, a woman poked her head out, saying, Hurry, this way. Miss Vera. Leaving Lurie's words hanging like a trail behind them, Dee ran toward the doorway, along with Lilia. There was a room choked with dust, and there were small windows to either side of the door. Lilia pressed her face against one. The limbless beetle still seemed fixated on Dee and the rest of them. Staring at the stone wall with eyes that weren't eyes, it unexpectedly dashed forward. Compared to its earlier movements, its speed was unbelievable. What in the... Lilia exclaimed, backing away in spite of herself. And then the door shuddered violently. There was an unnerving sound as cracks raced through the wall. That's some horsepower, Lilia said with a smile. Here it comes again. The beetle backed up. Then the white membranes assailed it. One after another they became unholy razors, dealing white cuts to the beetle's head and body. The beetle groaned. Turning its head, it tried to drive the membranes away, The depth and numbers of the cuts only increased. After suffering countless hits in the same spot, the beetle disgorged what could only be described as grayish blood from its wounds, and then every inch of it turned boiling hot. Once again, Lilia pulled her face back from the window, and an intense heat spread through the room. Into the next room, Vera shouted. Dee pushed Lurie and Vera into the room, then shut the door. He probably didn't throw Lilia in with them because she was a huntress. It's incredible, Lilia remarked with excitement. Every last one of the advancing membranes was enveloped by flames, reduced to ash before they fell to the floor. Every inch of the beetle was still burning hot, and the melting walls and ceiling around it began to collapse. Dee and Lilia moved into the other room, too. Vera and Lurie were already lying limply on the floor. That was on account of the heat that filled the room. If this keeps up, those two are goners. Not that it's a big deal or anything, Lilia asserted unpleasantly. She'd been a callous woman from the start, and after being bitten by Gilson, that trait only seemed to have been amplified. Another wall collapsed. They were less than 18 inches from the feverish hell. What do you intend to do, Dee? As Lilia made that mocking query, Dee stepped forward. Lilia could see how his eyes gleamed wildly. You don't mean to. For a few seconds, astonishment prevented the huntress from making any movement at all. Dee pulled the paralyzed Lilia close. She planted one hand against the black fabric of his chest to push him away. But there she was stopped, both physically and mentally. Oh, the look on Dee's face as he sank his fangs into her carotid artery. He had chosen to transform into a vampire. A second passed and then another, and as Dee quietly pulled away, Lilia simultaneously collapsed on the spot. There was something both disturbing and sensual in the way Dee wiped his lips with the back of his hand. Was that enough? He asked. More or less, the hoarse voice replied. A small face was rising in the palm of Dee's left hand. Another wall collapsed. The heat assailed them like a wild beast. So hot, Lurie muttered fuzzily. As if in response to that, Dee raised his left hand. From the little lips protruding from it something spurted. Fresh blood. The stream of blood eddied, forming layer upon layer, turning into crimson steam where it came in contact with the heat. It became a wall of red liquid that stood against temperature high enough to melt away even stone. It was obviously Lilia's blood. However, there was no way the small amount of blood taken from her should be able to counter the waves of heat that were ravaging this floor of the castle. Perhaps it was something in the nature of the blood, or maybe there was some magical power behind the way it had been spat out. But when the blood turned to steam, it seemed to multiply without end, becoming a bloody vortex that mesmerized the room, the world, the very heat, until at last the heat was gone. An ineffable stench of blood hung in the room, and Dee didn't so much as glance back at the boy, or the doctor by the wall, as he asked them, "Are you okay?" With unexpected speed, the exhausted Vera responded, "I'm fine. The child's fine too." As Louis lay there, the doctor had taken his pulse and checked his pupils. Dee had already stepped out into the corridor. The rooms along either side of it were all burnt out. There was no sign of the beetle or the living membranes. Had the battle ended with the beetle victorious? No. On the floor were about a dozen whitish lines, long and trailing like those threads. There were marks left where the beetle had bled. The membrane creatures had made manifest their terrible cutting ability. So they took each other out? No one replied to the left hand's question. My thoughts on the matter are that those were some of the creatures locked in that underground vault, and putting out that supernatural aura. Their poison must have selectively taken part of the shock from the blast in the laboratory, breaking it open. Which would mean the rest of them have escaped too. Sheesh. We've got guilds and servants and the aliens, plus monsters. This castle's turning into all sorts of hell. You better get those two out of here fast, even though they know your true nature now. At that point, the left hand made a garbled cry. Dee had balled it into a tight fist. He squeezed it harder, and more cruelly than ever.
That's a lot of writing to do.
Second part, end.